For centuries, the world's greatest empires told a lie about how modern finance was built. They claimed it rose from innovation, discipline, and the genius of Western banking. But in the vaults of forgotten archives, in the ledgers of vanished companies, and in the letters of men who shaped nations, a different story emerges. The foundations of modern capitalism, its banks, its corporations, even its superpowers, were not built on gold or industry. They were built on opium. And the moment the world realized this truth did not come with gunfire, but with ink. A treaty here, a shipping log there, quiet records showing how narcotics, grown by forced labor, smuggled on imperial ships, sold to millions, financed the rise of global finance. This is the story of how drug money built the modern world, and why the families, banks, and governments who profited from it still shape our lives today. The misconception. In 1820, if you walked into a London counting house, past the mahogany desks and brass scales, past the clerks scratching entries into leather-bound ledgers, you would witness what appeared to be the height of civilized commerce: tea, silk, porcelain, the respectable trade of empire. But there was something the ledgers didn't quite reveal, something the bankers themselves barely understood. The British Empire believed its wealth came from industry, from coal mines and textile mills, from the ingenuity of steam engines and the discipline of Protestant work ethic. They believed China was a closed, backward economy, rich in goods but poor in ambition. They believed their financial dominance was permanent, ordained by progress itself. They were wrong, because in the private accounts of the British East India Company, in the manifests of ships leaving Calcutta, in the coded correspondence between merchants and colonial governors, the numbers told a different story. Let me show you what they saw. In 1773, the East India Company shipped 75 tons of opium to China. The profits were modest but consistent. By 1790, that number had quietly grown to 270 tons. Still manageable, still a side commodity in the grand machinery of trade. But then came 1820. The shipments had exploded to 1,400 tons annually, and by 1838 they would reach 2,500 tons, more than 30 times the volume from just 60 years earlier. And here's what made finance clerks stop their pens mid-stroke. The profit margins were absurd. Tea trade returned perhaps 10 to 15%. Textiles, maybe 20% in a good year. But opium returned 400%, sometimes more. The numbers didn't make sense, not unless something fundamental had shifted in how empires made money. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London noticed it first. Ships carrying opium received coverage at rates that should have bankrupted the insurers. These were vessels sailing into hostile waters, smuggling contraband into a country that had banned it, risking seizure and execution. Yet the premiums were lower than those for wool shipments to Scotland. Why? Because the insurers knew something the public didn't. The British government had quietly guaranteed these shipments. Not officially, not in Parliament, but in handshake deals, in naval protection, in the silent understanding that opium ships would never truly be at risk. Then there were the banks. Barings Bank, one of the most conservative financial institutions in Europe, suddenly began extending massive credit lines to merchants whose only declared business was country trade. The loans were enormous. The collateral was vague, yet the repayments came like clockwork. One clerk at Baring Brothers later wrote in a private letter, "We finance ghosts. The balance sheets show figures that cannot exist by any legitimate means. Yet the gold arrives, month after month, as reliable as the tides." This was the first crack in the misconception, the quiet realization that something vast and hidden was funding the empire. In 1830, a junior analyst at the Bank of England compiled a confidential report. It was never published. It barely circulated beyond 3 men. But it contained a conclusion that would have scandalized the nation. The silver reserves backing our currency are maintained not by trade surpluses, but by narcotics revenue from the East. Should this trade cease, the solvency of the realm itself would be in question within 18 months. Read that again. The Bank of England, the institution that would become the model for central banking worldwide, was dependent on drug money. But here's what's even more shocking. They knew it wasn't sustainable. They knew China would eventually resist. They knew millions were becoming addicted. They knew the silver was draining from Chinese provinces, destabilizing an empire of 400 million people. And they didn't care, because by 1830, opium wasn't funding a trade route. It was funding the entire British financial system, the dividends paid to aristocrats, the bonds held by widows and clergy, the expansion of the Royal Navy, the very infrastructure of the empire. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like on the ground. In the port of Canton, Chinese smugglers would row out to British ships anchored beyond the harbour. The opium, packed in chests of 140 pounds each, would be offloaded in darkness. Payment came in silver coins, weighed on portable scales right there on the water. The silver would then be carried back to the British ships, packed into strongboxes, and shipped to London. From there, it flowed into the Bank of England's vaults, into the reserves that backed the pound sterling, into the credit that financed railways and factories and the Industrial Revolution itself. This was the hidden engine behind empire, a narcotics pipeline so vast, so profitable, so essential to British power that it couldn't be shut down without collapsing the entire system. But there was a problem. China had finally noticed. Act 2. The Opium Wars. When? Finance went to war. By 1839, China was dying, not from famine, not from plague, but from addiction. In the coastal provinces, entire villages had stopped working. Men lay in opium dens, pipes in hand, eyes vacant. The silver that had circulated through China's economy for centuries, the currency of taxes, of trade, of daily life, was hemorrhaging outward, flowing into British coffers at a rate that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The numbers were catastrophic. Between 1800 and 1838, an estimated 100 million silver dollars drained from China. That's roughly 3,600 tons of silver, vanished into the pockets of British and American merchants. The emperor's advisors presented him with reports that read like battlefield assessments. 10 million Chinese addicted, 20 million. Some estimates ran as high as 30 million, nearly 10% of the population. But this wasn't just a social crisis. It was an existential economic threat. China's tax revenues were collapsing. Farmers couldn't pay levies. Provincial governors couldn't fund public works. The imperial treasury was running dry, and all because of a drug that foreigners were forcing into the country at gunpoint. In March 1839, Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu made a decision that would reshape the world. He confiscated 1,400 tons of British opium, worth roughly $10 million in 1839 currency, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, and destroyed it in massive public demonstrations. Dissolved in lime, flushed into the sea, while thousands watched. The message was clear. This ends now. In London, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Because here's what most histories don't tell you. Britain was already in a financial crisis. The Bank of England's reserves were dangerously low. The East India Company was on the verge of insolvency, kept alive only by opium revenues. Military expenses from colonial wars had drained the treasury, and the Industrial Revolution, for all its promise, hadn't yet generated the wealth to sustain an empire of this scale. Britain needed that opium money desperately. The merchants who had just lost $10 million in confiscated drugs didn't just want revenge. They wanted insurance. They wanted a guarantee that this pipeline would never be threatened again. So they went to Parliament. William Jardine, founder of Jardine Matheson, one of the largest opium trading houses, personally lobbied Foreign Secretary Palmerston. He brought ledgers. he brought projections. He showed them what would happen to British banks, British pensions, British power if the opium trade ended, and Parliament listened, because they understood something the textbooks skip over. This wasn't a war over trade imbalance or diplomatic insult. This was a war to protect the most profitable drug pipeline in human history. They believed China would see a show of force and capitulate immediately. They believed this would be a minor conflict, a few ships, a few battles, a quick treaty. They were wrong, but not in the way you might think. In 1840, a British fleet of 16 warships arrived off the Chinese coast. They carried 4,000 troops, modern artillery, and steam-powered gunboats that could navigate rivers Chinese forces couldn't defend. What followed was one of the most one-sided military campaigns in history. Chinese war junks, wooden sailing vessels armed with medieval cannons, faced iron-hulled steamships with rifled artillery. Chinese soldiers with matchlock muskets faced British infantry with percussion cap rifles. It wasn't a war, it was a massacre. Within 18 months, Britain had captured Shanghai, Ningbo, and strategic ports along the coast. Chinese forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties. British forces lost fewer than 70 men in combat. And here's the part that changed everything. The financial markets went insane. East India Company stock, which had been declining, suddenly surged. Shares of British shipping companies doubled. Insurance firms that had backed the opium trade saw their valuations skyrocket because investors realized what had just happened. A modern military power had gone to war explicitly to protect a drug pipeline, and won, decisively. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, was the birth certificate of narco-capitalism. China was forced to pay $21 million in reparations, mostly to reimburse British merchants for the destroyed opium. They ceded Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. They opened 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, and crucially, they agreed to tariffs so low that Britain could flood China with opium without meaningful restriction. But here's what the treaty didn't say explicitly, but everyone understood. Britain had just established the world's first narco-state. Hong Kong became the opium laundering capital of the world. Banks opened specifically to handle drug money. Shipping firms set up offices to coordinate smuggling. Insurance companies formalized policies for narcotics cargo, and the system worked flawlessly. By 1850, opium accounted for 46% of British India's revenue. That's not a side business. That's not a trade commodity. That's the foundation of colonial finance. Let me put this in perspective. Today, if nearly half of the US government's revenue came from drug trafficking, we would call that a failed state. We would call that a criminal enterprise. But in 1850, we called it the British Empire. And the mechanism they built, the banking structures, the shipping networks, the legal frameworks for laundering illegal profits, would become the template for modern finance. Act 3. How drug money built Wall Street. Now let's cross the Atlantic, because while Britain was perfecting the opium trade in the East, American merchant families were quietly building the financial foundations of the United States on the same drug. In the 1830s, if you walked through the offices of Boston's elite merchant houses, you would see portraits of distinguished men, philanthropists, university founders, respectable traders in tea and silk. But in their private ledgers, in the manifests of their clipper ships, in the bills of lading filed in quiet port offices, the truth was written in plain numbers. Warren Delano II, grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made his fortune in the opium trade. His firm, Russell & Company, was the largest American opium dealer in China. His ships carried Turkish opium from Smyrna to Canton, returning with silver and Chinese goods. When Delano died, he left an estate worth millions, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. That wealth would eventually help fund his grandson's political career, the same grandson who would become president. The same president whose New Deal would reshape American capitalism. The foundation was opium money. Then there was John Murray Forbes, Boston Brahmin, railroad magnate. His early capital came from Russell and Company partnerships in the China opium trade. He later used those profits to finance the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, one of the arteries of American westward expansion. The Perkins family, the Cabot family, the Cushing family, every major Boston merchant dynasty had fingers in the opium trade, and every one of them used those profits to build the institutions we know today. Harvard University's early endowments were built partly on opium money. Yale received donations from families whose wealth came from narcotics. The Boston Athenaeum, that temple of learning and culture, was funded by men who made fortunes selling addiction. But here's what makes this especially shocking. They didn't see it as immoral. In letters and diaries from the period, these merchants described opium as simply another commodity, like tobacco or alcohol. They genuinely believed they were engaging in respectable trade. One merchant wrote, "The Chinese demand the product. We merely supply it. Are we to blame if they lack the temperance of Western men?" This was the American misconception. They believed they were competing in a world of fair trade. They believed Europe's empires ran on industry and innovation. They believed their own fortunes were built on shrewd business sense. They were wrong. Because when you examine the ledgers, when you actually run the numbers, the profit margins were impossible by legitimate means. Russell and Company's opium operations returned 50 to 70% annual profits, consistently, for decades. Compare that to the 6 to 10% that most trade goods generated, and you realize this wasn't normal business. This was a money-printing machine. But it gets deeper. These merchant families didn't just sell opium. They created the financial infrastructure that made modern American capitalism possible. They pioneered maritime insurance for high-risk cargo. They developed bill of lading systems that could handle illicit goods. They created partnership structures that limited liability while maximizing profit. The early templates for limited liability corporations. When you trace the lineage of American investment banking, you find opium money at the root. The capital that built railroads, that financed factories, that backed the expansion of American industry. Much of it started as drug profits from China. Let me show you how the mechanism worked. An American merchant ship would leave Boston loaded with goods, usually metals, furs, or cotton. It would sail to Turkey or India, where it would trade those goods for opium. The opium would then be transported to China and sold for silver. The silver would be used to buy tea, silk, and porcelain, which would be shipped back to America and sold at enormous markup. The profit happened at every stage, but the real money was in the opium to silver conversion. That's where 400% returns lived. And because this trade was technically illegal in China, it required sophisticated smuggling operations, secret anchorages, bribed officials, encrypted ledgers, all the mechanisms of organized crime, but backed by respectable Boston firms with Harvard-educated clerks. This is how drug money became respectable. Through time, through reinvestment, through the slow alchemy of laundering profits into legitimate enterprise. By 1850, many of these fortunes had been cleaned. The opium ships were sold, the partnerships dissolved, the capital moved into railroads, textiles, and banking, and the families simply became old money. But the structures remained. The shipping companies that had carried opium became legitimate freight carriers. The banks that had financed drug smuggling became respectable institutions. The insurance firms that had covered narcotics cargo became pillars of American finance. And the legal innovation they pioneered, the corporate structures that separated illegal operations from personal liability, became the foundation of modern business law. This was the birth of the first true multinational corporations, entities that could operate across borders, beyond the reach of any single government's law, designed explicitly to handle profits from illegal trade. When we talk about corporate personhood, about limited liability, about the separation of ownership and management, these weren't invented for legitimate business. They were invented to protect opium merchants from prosecution. The ghost in the machine of capitalism is narcotics money, and it's been there from the beginning. Active 4. The shadow financial system. By 1860, something extraordinary had happened. The world's first global financial system had emerged, and it was built entirely around laundering drug money. Let me show you how deep this goes. Hong Kong, ceded to Britain after the Opium War, became the prototype for what we now call offshore banking. It was a colonial territory with British law, but outside the jurisdiction of Parliament's direct oversight. It was a free port with minimal tariffs, and it was the hub through which opium money flowed into the global banking system. In 1865, a group of merchants founded the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC. The bank's explicit purpose was to finance trade between China, India, and Europe. But everyone understood what trade meant. The bank's early ledgers are filled with opium transactions, thinly disguised as country trade, or simply listed under coded commodity names. HSBC pioneered techniques that would become standard practice in offshore banking. They developed systems for moving money across borders without government oversight. They created accounts that could be held in multiple currencies, shielding clients from exchange rate scrutiny. They built relationships with correspondent banks in every major port, allowing seamless transfers of funds. This wasn't innovation for efficiency. This was innovation for secrecy, and it worked spectacularly. By 1875, HSBC was one of the largest banks in the world. Its depositors included Chinese merchants, British colonial officials, Indian princes, and American traders, all of them connected by a single invisible thread: opium money. But HSBC wasn't alone. Chartered Bank, Standard Chartered, the Mercantile Bank of India, all of them emerged in this same ecosystem. All of them developed the same techniques. All of them would later evolve into the global banking giants we know today. Now let's talk about the accounting innovation that made this possible. Double-entry bookkeeping for illegal trade. This sounds technical, but it's actually brilliant in its simplicity. Here's how it worked. An opium merchant would have two sets of books. The public ledger showed legitimate trade: tea, silk, porcelain. The private ledger showed opium transactions. The two sets of books would be reconciled through a third set of accounts held by the bank, which never explicitly mentioned opium, but tracked the actual flow of money. So if an investigator looked at the merchant's books, they would see normal trade. If they looked at the bank's books, they would see loans and deposits. But the bank held the cipher, the codes that revealed which transactions were actually opium revenue. This system required unprecedented cooperation between merchants, banks, and colonial governments. It required legal structures that protected this secrecy, and it required a level of financial sophistication that simply didn't exist in legitimate trade. Why? Because legitimate trade didn't need it. If you're selling textiles, you don't need encrypted ledgers. If you're importing tea, you don't need shell companies in 3 jurisdictions. But if you're moving drug money, you need all of it. And once those systems existed, they didn't disappear when opium trade declined. They simply evolved, became the template for tax avoidance, for sanctions evasion, for the entire offshore banking industry that dominates global finance today. The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Singapore. These modern tax havens trace their institutional DNA directly back to Hong Kong's opium banks. The legal structures are nearly identical. The mechanisms are the same. Only the product has changed. Now, here's the truly disturbing part. Entire nations became narcotics syndicates. Britain wasn't just permitting opium trade. It was enforcing it with military power, regulating it with colonial law, and depending on it for fiscal survival. By 1880, opium revenues accounted for 15% of British India's total government income. That's not a sideshow. That's a pillar of imperial administration. Think about what that means. British colonial governors were functionally drug cartel administrators. Their salaries were paid with narcotics money. Their budgets depended on addiction rates staying high. They had a direct financial incentive to expand drug use. And they did. Aggressively. The British Raj developed sophisticated marketing for opium. They created government-sanctioned opium dens. They advertised opium as medicine. They pushed it through colonial doctors and government stores. When consumption dropped, they launched campaigns to increase it. This was the first narco-state. Not a failed government corrupted by cartels, but a functioning empire whose economic model was indistinguishable from organized crime. And the United States? American merchants were private drug financiers. They didn't have colonial governments to back them, so they innovated with pure capitalism. They created the first modern drug cartels, corporate structures with vertical integration, from poppy fields to banking. Russell and Company controlled opium production, shipping, distribution, and money laundering. They employed thousands. They had offices on 3 continents. They had their own private security forces. They were, in every meaningful sense, a transnational criminal organization, except they were legal, respected. Their executives sat on university boards. Their shareholders were church deacons. This was the great inversion. The line between legitimate business and organized crime had dissolved so completely that they became indistinguishable. And China became the first forced consumer market in history, an entire economy restructured around addiction, enforced by foreign military power with no ability to resist. By 1890, an estimated 40 million Chinese were opium users. The silver drainage had reversed into a flood of worthless opium flowing in. The imperial government was powerless. The economy was shattered. China had become the world's first narco-colony, a nation enslaved not by occupation, but by addiction. And the wealth generated by this enslavement? It became the foundation of modern finance. The central banking systems that manage our currencies today, they evolved from institutions that depended on opium revenue. The maritime insurance industry that covers global shipping, it was pioneered to protect drug cargo. The corporate legal structures that define modern business, they were designed to launder narcotics profits. Even the concept of a global reserve currency has its roots in this period. The pound sterling became the world's dominant currency, not because of British manufacturing, but because British banks held the silver extracted from China through opium. This was the moment of great realization. Just as Germany would later discover that America was an unstoppable industrial machine, China discovered that the West's financial system was built on narcotics. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. The systems were entrenched. The wealth had been transferred and legitimized. And the mechanism, the beautiful, terrible mechanism of turning addiction into empire, had become permanent. ACT-FIV, the legacy, why this still matters. Walk into any HSBC branch today, look at the logo. Those letters stand for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, founded in 1865 to finance opium trade. The bank would later claim it was established for legitimate commerce, but the founding shareholders were opium merchants. The initial deposits were drug money. The correspondent relationships were with other narcotics banks. Today, HSBC is one of the largest financial institutions on earth. It operates in 64 countries. It manages trillions in assets. And in 2012, it was caught laundering money for Mexican drug cartels. The cycle hadn't ended. It had just found new products. Jardine Matheson, the trading house founded by William Jardine to dominate the opium trade, still exists. It's now a diversified conglomerate worth over $60 billion. It owns real estate, retail chains, and hotels across Asia. The Keswick family, descendants of Jardine's partners, still control it. The wealth never disappeared. It just got respectable. Forbes and Company, another major opium trader, gave rise to the Forbes family. Yes, that Forbes, the magazine dynasty. The initial capital that launched that empire came from narcotics. And it's not just about old money. The mechanisms pioneered during the opium trade era are still with us. Offshore banking, that's Hong Kong's gift to modern finance. Tax havens, developed to hide opium profits. Shell corporations, invented to distance merchants from illegal cargo. Correspondent banking networks that move money across borders with minimal oversight. That's straight from the opium playbook. When we talk about wealth inequality, about generational privilege, about why some families stay rich for centuries, this is part of the answer. Because the wealth generated by opium trade was so vast, so concentrated, and so carefully laundered that it became permanent. The Delano family fortune funded FDR's entry into politics. The Forbes fortune built a media empire. The Boston Brahmin families still dominate New England's elite institutions. Their children attend the same universities their opium-trading ancestors endowed. But here's the moral inversion that should disturb us most. Addiction created fortunes. Addiction created corporations. Addiction created empires. And we still live in the world those empires built. The legal structures that protect corporate profits over human welfare. Those were pioneered to protect drug merchants. The banking secrecy laws that let wealth hide from taxation. Those came from opium finance. The concept that corporations are people, with rights but limited liability, that was invented to shield narcotics traders from prosecution. When we wonder why our financial system seems designed to extract wealth from the poor and concentrate it in the hands of the few, this is part of the answer. Because it was designed that way. Literally. The system was built to turn addiction into profit, to turn suffering into capital, to turn millions of destroyed lives into generational wealth. Just as German soldiers in World War II discovered they were facing an American industrial machine beyond comprehension, China discovered in the 1840s that they were facing a financial machine, one powered by addiction, protected by empire, and fed by global trade. And that machine didn't stop when opium trade declined. It simply found new products, new markets, new populations to exploit. The cycle continues because the structures remain. The banks that laundered opium money still launder money. The corporate forms that protected drug merchants still protect corporations from accountability. The offshore havens that hid narcotics profits still hide wealth from taxation. We live in a world built on opium money. Our financial institutions, our legal structures, our concepts of corporate power, all of them trace back to the moment when empires realized that addiction was the most profitable product in human history. And the families, banks, and governments who profited from it, they still shape our lives today. Their descendants sit on corporate boards. Their institutions manage our savings. Their legal innovations define how business operates. The ghost of the opium trade haunts modern capitalism. And until we recognize that ghost, until we understand how our financial system was truly built, we can't begin to imagine what a different system might look like. This is the legacy, not just history, not just an uncomfortable truth about the past, but a living system, still operating, still extracting, still turning suffering into profit. The opium economy didn't end. It just became the economy, and that should terrify us.